The morning light from 3 different suns streamed through the crystal windows of the Galactic Academy of Sciences. Students from dozens of worlds hurried through the hallways, their various forms creating a strange parade of shapes and colors. Some floated like glowing clouds, others walked on multiple legs, and a few seemed to phase in and out of existence as they moved out in classroom 7 Alpha. Professor Velik stood at the front of the room, preparing for his advanced xenobiology class. His blue skin shimmered as he arranged his teaching materials on the floating desk. The professor had taught at the academy for over 200 years, and he thought he had seen everything. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The students began filing into the room. First came the ethereals, their crystal bodies chiming softly as they moved. These beings naturally lived for thousands of years, their consciousness slowly growing through their translucent forms like beautiful geometric patterns. They took their seats with graceful movements that made no sound. Next entered the members of the collective, their shared consciousness allowing them to move as one unit even though they appeared as separate individuals. They communicated through subtle color changes on their skin, creating a rainbow of silent conversation as they settled into their chairs. The Luminari drifted in next, their energy forms barely contained within their protective suits. These beings existed as pure light and thought, only wearing physical forms when they needed to interact with solid matter. They hummed quietly to themselves, a sound like distant music. Finally, the humans arrived. They walked in, talking loudly to each other, their voices carrying across the room in a way that made the other students uncomfortable. Professor Velik noticed how the aliens always seemed to tense up when the humans entered any room. Doyen was the first human through the door. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that never seemed to stay neat. His eyes moved constantly, always looking at everything around him as if he was studying it. Behind him came Mira, who was shorter with bright eyes that seemed to see too much. She carried a bag filled with books and electronic devices that the other students found strange. Wanho and Sala entered together, still discussing something in their native language. Wanho was broad-shouldered and moved with the confident walk of someone who had never met a problem he could not solve. Sala was quiet but intense, her attention focused on a small device in her hands that displayed complex equations. The humans were famous throughout the galaxy as Deathworlders, beings who came from a planet so dangerous that just surviving there made them incredibly tough. Earth was known for its extreme weather, deadly animals, and countless ways to die. The fact that any species had not only survived there, but had developed space travel made them legendary. Professor Velik called the class to order. The various students settled into their seats, though the humans continued to whisper among themselves, until the professor cleared his throat loudly. "Today, we begin your semester project," Professor Velik announced. His voice carried the authority of someone who had taught thousands of students over the centuries. "You will be studying one of the most important aspects of existence itself. Your assignment is to research and present on cultural approaches to mortality." A ripple of interest moved through the class. This was clearly a topic that affected every species differently. Each group will examine how different civilizations handle death and the concept of finite existence. The professor continued, "You will explore the philosophical, cultural, and practical approaches that various species have developed to deal with mortality." The ethereals chimed softly among themselves, their crystal forms brightening with what seemed like pleasure. They had much to share about their long lives and eventual transformation into pure energy. The collective members shifted colors rapidly as they processed the assignment through their shared consciousness. They would have interesting perspectives on how individual death affected the greater whole. The Luminari hummed more loudly. Akani, their energy forms pulsing with excitement. They had already transcended physical death in many ways and would enjoy sharing their experiences. But the humans had a different reaction entirely. Doyen raised his hand before Professor Velik had finished explaining the assignment. Professor, can we study theoretical approaches to defeating death entirely, like methods that could eliminate mortality as a concept? The professor paused, clearly surprised by the question. Defeating death? That is impossible, Mr. Doyen. Death is a fundamental aspect of existence. It is what gives life meaning and drives evolution forward. But what if it is not impossible? Doyen pressed. What if death is just another problem that can be solved through science and technology? Professor Velik laughed, though there was something uncomfortable in the sound. Death cannot be solved because it is not a problem. It is simply the way of things. Your assignment is to study how cultures accept and deal with mortality, not to fantasize about avoiding it. The other students in the class seemed to agree with the professor. The ethereals chimed in harmonious agreement, while the collective shifted to calming blue colors. The luminari hummed in what sounded like gentle correction, but the humans did not look convinced. Mira was already taking notes in her electronic device, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Wano and Sola had leaned forward in their seats, their attention completely focused on the conversation. We understand the assignment, Professor, Mira said carefully. But surely, part of studying cultural approaches to mortality would include examining cultures that refuse to accept death as inevitable. Professor Velik frowned. What cultures refuse to accept death? Every intelligent species in the galaxy has learned to accept mortality as natural. The humans exchanged glances. It was just a quick look between them, but somehow it made the other students in the room very nervous. There was something in that shared glance that suggested the humans knew something the others did not. Of course, Professor, Doyen said smoothly. We will study cultural approaches to mortality, just as you have assigned. But as the professor began explaining the details of the project, the aliens in the class noticed that the humans were not really listening to the instructions about accepting death. Instead, they were whispering among themselves and taking notes about something completely different. The ethereals began to feel something they had never experienced before. It was a cold sensation that seemed to spread through their crystal forms. The collective members started shifting to darker colors, their shared consciousness picking up on a disturbance they could not identify. The luminari stopped humming entirely, their energy forms flickering with what might have been worried. As the class ended and students began to leave, the humans gathered their materials slowly. They were still talking quietly among themselves, but now the other students could catch fragments of their conversation. The professor thinks it is impossible, Myra was saying. Most people do, Wonho replied. That is what makes it interesting. We should start with the basics, Sola added. Life extension, cellular repair, consciousness transfer. Do not forget genetic modification, Doyen said as they headed toward the door, and cryogenic preservation. We have a lot of ground to cover. The humans left the classroom. They continued their discussion in the hallway. Their voices faded as they walked away, but their words left the remaining students sitting in stunned silence. The aliens realized that while they had been assigned to study how cultures accept death, the humans seemed to be planning something entirely different. They were going to study how to defeat death itself. And somehow, that idea was more terrifying than anything their dangerous death world had ever produced. 3 days after Professor Velik gave the assignment, the library of the Galactic Academy had become a very different place. Students from various species had claimed their usual study areas and begun their research into cultural approaches to mortality. The ethereals had gathered in the meditation section, their crystal forms creating beautiful patterns of light as they accessed their racial memories. They were compiling thousands of years of wisdom about accepting the natural cycle of existence. Their research focused on the peaceful transition from physical form to pure energy that their species experienced. The collective had taken over. a group study room where they could share information through their connected consciousness. They were examining how individual death strengthened their species as a whole, and how the loss of one member actually enriched the experiences of all others. The Luminari had positioned themselves near the energy research terminals, their forms flickering as they accessed databases about transcendence and the movement between different states of being. They were studying how death was simply another form of transformation, but the humans had claimed the restricted access section of the library, KIWON. The head librarian watched nervously as the human students requested access to databases that most species never bothered to examine. His 6 eyes blinked in different patterns as he processed their unusual research requests. "You want access to the Forbidden Technologies Archive?" Kiwan asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Most students do not even know that section exists. We need to research all possible approaches to extending life," Duyan explained calmly. "Our project requires comprehensive coverage of the topic. But those archives contain information about technologies that were banned by the Galactic Council," Kiwan protested. "Methods that were deemed too dangerous or unethical to pursue." Mira looked up from her notes. "We are not planning to build anything. We just need to understand what has been tried before." The librarian's eyes continued blinking in distress patterns, but he eventually granted them access. As he walked away, he muttered something in his native language that sounded like a prayer for protection. The humans spread out across multiple research terminals, their fingers flying across holographic keyboards as they dove into information that had been sealed away for good reasons. Other students in the library began to notice their unusual behavior. "Look at this," Wano said quietly to his teammates. "The Vexlan Empire tried cellular regeneration therapy 1,500 years ago. They managed to extend their lifespans by 300% before their government shut down the program." "Why did they stop?" Sola asked, not looking up from her own research. "The report says they were concerned about social stability," Wanho replied. "But look at the actual data. They were getting close to true biological immortality." Myra had found something even more interesting. The Corvani developed consciousness transfer technology 1,000 years ago. They could move a being's entire mind from one body to another. "What happened to them?" Doyan asked. "They still exist, but they banned the technology," Mira said. "They decided it was unnatural to avoid death by jumping between bodies." The humans exchanged that look again, the same one that had made their classmates uncomfortable in Professor Velik's class. It was a look that suggested they thought the other species had given up to Izali Dot at a nearby table. 3 ethereal students were trying to focus on their own research, but they kept overhearing fragments of the human conversation. The words they caught made them increasingly disturbed. "Cryogenic preservation maintains cellular structure indefinitely," one of the humans was saying. "Nanotechnology could repair damage at the molecular level," another added. "Genetic engineering could eliminate the aging process entirely," a third contributed. The ethereals began to chime in distress harmonies. These were not the kinds of conversations they expected to hear in an academic setting. The humans were not studying how cultures accepted death. They were researching how to prevent it. Word spread quickly through the library's alien student population. The collective members started shifting to warning colors, their shared consciousness picking up on the growing unease. The Luminari stopped humming entirely, their energy forms flickering with what could only be described as alarm, but the humans seemed completely unaware of the effect they were having on their classmates. They continued their research with the focused intensity that had made them legendary throughout the galaxy. "Earth has been working on life extension for centuries," Taman said as he joined the group. He was carrying a personal data pad loaded with information from their home world. "I brought some research from our home databases." The other humans gathered around as Taman displayed his findings. The information on his device made even them pause in surprise. "This is incredible," Mira breathed. "Human scientists have already achieved significant life extension through medical technology. Look at these numbers," Wanho said, pointing to charts and graphs. "Average human lifespan has increased by 200% in the last 3 centuries. And this is just the beginning," Taman added. "These are the publicly available research results. Classified projects are much more advanced." Doyen leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "What kind of classified projects?" "Consciousness backup systems," Taman said quietly. "Digital storage of human memories and personality patterns. Complete organ replacement using artificial alternatives. Genetic modifications that stop cellular aging entirely." "Are you saying humans have already achieved some forms of immortality?" Sola asked. "Not exactly," Taman replied. "But we are much closer than anyone realizes. The technology exists, it just needs to be refined and combined properly." The conversation was taking place in normal speaking voices, but somehow it felt like they were discussing something forbidden. The alien students in the library had stopped pretending to work on their own projects and were openly staring at the human table. "This is not theoretical research," one of the ethereals whispered to another. "They are planning something. Talk about defeating death as if it is just another engineering problem," a collective member added, their skin shifting to deep purple with worry. "No species should have this kind of power," a luminary said, their energy form pulsing with distress. But the humans continued their work, completely absorbed in their research. They spent hours examining banned technologies, failed experiments, theoretical frameworks that other species had abandoned as too dangerous or unethical. "We need to approach this systematically," Doyen said, as they prepared to leave the library. "Medical life extension is the foundation. Then we add genetic modifications, consciousness storage, and artificial enhancement. Do not forget environmental factors," Mira added. "Cryogenic preservation, radiation shielding, and hazard avoidance. We should also research psychological approaches," Wanho suggested. "How to maintain mental health over extended lifespans. Social structures," Sola concluded. "How immortal beings would organize society." As the humans packed up their research materials, the library fell silent except for the soft sounds of alien distress. The ethereals were chiming in minor keys. The collective members had all shifted to dark colors, and the luminari were barely visible as they tried to contain their energy forms. The humans walked out of the library, talking excitedly about their discoveries, leaving behind a room full of terrified alien students who were beginning to understand that their human classmates were not just studying mortality, they were planning to conquer it. The day of presentations arrived with unusual tension in the air. Professor Velik had noticed that his students seemed more nervous than usual, though he could not understand why. The assignment had been straightforward enough, and every species in the galaxy had their own cultural approaches to mortality to discuss. The classroom felt different as students filed in. The ethereals moved more slowly than usual, their crystal forms dim and subdued. The collective members sat closer together, their skin colors muted and cautious. "Huh?" The luminari flickered weakly in their containment suits, as if they were trying to make themselves invisible. Only the humans seemed normal. They entered, talking quietly among themselves, carrying data pads and projection devices. Doyen, Mira, Wanho, Sola, and Taman took their seats with the same casual confidence they always displayed. "Today, we will hear your presentations on cultural approaches to mortality," Professor Velik announced. "Each group will have 20 minutes to present their findings. We'll begin with the ethereals." The crystal beings rose gracefully and moved to the front of the classroom. Their leader, a tall being named Zephyr, activated a holographic display that showed beautiful images of their homeworld. Our species has studied the question of mortality for over 10,000 years, Zephyr began, their voice creating musical tones that filled the room. We have learned that death is not an enemy to be fought, but a teacher to be welcomed. The presentation continued with elegant descriptions of how ethereal culture had developed around the acceptance of their natural lifespan. They explained how knowing life was finite gave meaning to every moment, how the approach of death brought wisdom and peace. When our crystal forms begin to fade, Zephyr concluded, we do not mourn or resist. We celebrate the transition to pure energy, knowing that we are becoming part of something greater than ourselves. The other alien students nodded in appreciation. This was the kind of presentation they had expected, full of wisdom and acceptance. The collective presented next. Their speaker, a being who shifted through multiple shades of blue and green, explained how their species viewed individual death as strengthening the whole. When one of us dies, their experiences and memories become part of our shared consciousness, the speaker explained. Death is not loss, but contribution. Each individual death makes our entire species stronger and wiser. Their presentation included complex diagrams showing how knowledge and experience flowed through their collective mind. How death was simply another form of sharing that enriched everyone. The Luminari followed with their own perspective on mortality. Their representative, barely visible as a shimmer of light, spoke about death as transformation. We do not truly die, the Luminari explained. We simply change from one state of energy to another. What others call death, we call graduation. We move from physical existence to pure thought and light. Each alien presentation followed the same pattern. Death was natural. Death was meaningful. Death was to be accepted with grace and wisdom. The presentations were beautiful and thoughtful, exactly what Professor Velik had hoped to hear. Then it was time for the humans to present. Doyan stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. He activated a holographic display that was immediately different from the others. Instead of peaceful images of acceptance, his display showed charts, graphs, and technical diagrams. Our research into cultural approaches to mortality has revealed something interesting, Doyan began. While most species in the galaxy have developed philosophies of acceptance, humanity has taken a completely different approach. The alien students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not what they had expected. Humans viewed death not as natural or inevitable, but as humanity's greatest enemy, Doyan continued. Our entire cultural development has been focused on one goal, defeating death entirely. Professor Velik leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Doyan, I believe you may have misunderstood the assignment. We are studying how cultures accept mortality, not how they fight it. But this is how human culture approaches mortality, Doyan replied calmly. We fight it. A holographic display changed to show a timeline of human medical advances. The numbers made the alien students gasp in shock. 300 years ago, humans lived for approximately 70 years, Doyan explained. Today, the average human lifespan is over 200 years. We have tripled our natural lifespan through medical technology. Mira stood up to join the presentation, but we did not consider this sufficient. Human culture views our current lifespans as unacceptably short. We are actively working toward true immortality. Immortality, Professor Velik interrupted, is impossible. Every species eventually dies. Not necessarily, Wonho said as he activated another display. Human scientists have developed multiple approaches to extending life indefinitely. Cryogenic preservation allows us to pause biological processes entirely. We can freeze a human body and revive it centuries later. The ethereals began to chime in distress harmonies. This was not natural. This was not right. We have also developed organ replacement technology, Sola added. When a human organ fails, we can replace it with an artificial one that will function for thousands of years. Some humans have already replaced most of their biological parts. This is just the beginning, Taman said, taking over the presentation. We are working on consciousness transfer technology, the ability to move a human mind from one body to another, or even into a completely artificial form. The holographic display showed complex diagrams of brain scanning technology, consciousness mapping, and digital storage systems. The alien students stared in horror as they realized the implications. Human culture has also developed genetic modification techniques, Doyen continued. We can edit our genetic code to eliminate aging entirely. Here, some humans have already undergone these modifications. You are talking about playing God, Professor Velik said, his voice filled with shock. You are describing the complete elimination of natural order. We are describing problem solving, Mira replied. Humans do not accept that death is natural. We view it as a technical challenge to be overcome through science and engineering. The presentation continued with more shocking revelations. Humans had developed radiation shielding that could protect them in environments that would kill other species. They had created medical nanobots that could repair damage at the cellular level. They had built backup systems for storing human memories and personalities. But why? Zephyr asked, their crystal form flickering with confusion. Why would any species want to avoid the natural cycle of existence? 'Cause we can, Wonho answered simply. Because death is not natural law. It is just another problem waiting to be solved. The alien students sat in stunned silence as the humans concluded their presentation. Everything they had been taught about the natural order of existence had been challenged by these Deathworlders who refused to accept any limits. Our research shows that while other species have developed cultures of acceptance, humans have developed a culture of conquest, Doyen said as he prepared to sit down. We do not accept death because we believe we have the right to exist indefinitely. We have the technology to make it happen, Myra added quietly as the humans returned to their seats. The classroom fell silent, except for the soft sounds of alien distress. The ethereals were chiming in minor keys. The collective members had shifted to dark purple colors, and the luminari were barely visible as they tried to contain their flickering energy forms. Professor Velik stared at the humans with an expression of complete bewilderment. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered a species that approached mortality with such systematic determination to defeat it. The presentations were over, but the real horror was just beginning. The days following the presentations were unlike anything the Galactic Academy had ever experienced. Word of the human presentation had spread throughout the school. Koi and alien students gathered in small groups to whisper about what they had learned. Professor Velik found himself unable to concentrate on his other classes. The human presentation had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He had taught thousands of students from hundreds of species, but never had he encountered beings who approached the fundamental nature of existence with such cold determination. 3 days after the presentations, he made a decision that would change everything. He called the human students to his office for what he claimed was a follow-up discussion about their research. The office was small and cramped, filled with specimens and artifacts from across the galaxy. Professor Velik sat behind his desk, his blue skin darker than usual with stress. The 5 human students arranged themselves in chairs facing him, their expressions calm and patient. I need to understand something, Professor Velik began carefully. Your presentation mentioned technologies that most species would consider impossible or unethical. How much of what you described actually exists? The humans exchanged glances. It was Wanho who answered first. Love it, he said simply. Everything we described is currently being used by humans somewhere in the galaxy. Professor Velik felt His heart skipped a beat. You mean these are not theoretical concepts? These technologies are real. Very real, Myra confirmed. Human medical technology has advanced far beyond what most species realize. We have been extending human lifespans for centuries. But the organ replacement technology you mentioned, the professor pressed. The ability to replace biological parts with artificial ones. That seems impossible. Spayman reached into his bag and pulled out a small device. He placed it on the professor's desk, where it projected a holographic image of a human torso. The image showed a complex network of organs, but many of them glowed with artificial light. This is a scan of my current body, Temin explained calmly. As you can see, my heart, liver, kidneys, and lungs are all artificial, were replaced over the last 50 years as the original organs began to fail. Professor Velik stared at the image in shock. 50 years? How old are you? I am currently 143 years old, Temin replied. I have been using life extension technology for most of my adult life. The professor's hands trembled as he absorbed this information. But you look like you are barely 20 years old. Genetic modification, Sola explained. We can edit our DNA to prevent aging. The technology has existed for over a century. This is impossible, Professor Velik whispered. If humans have had this technology for so long, why has the rest of the galaxy not heard about it? Because we learned early that other species find our approach to mortality disturbing, Doyan said. We keep our life extension research private to avoid frightening our galactic neighbors. The professor felt a chill run through his body. How many humans are using these technologies? Approximately 60% of the human population has some form of life extension enhancement, Mira answered. The percentage is growing every year, okay? And the consciousness transfer technology you mentioned, Professor Velik asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. I have died 3 times, one host said casually. Each time, my consciousness was transferred to a new body. The first time was in a shuttle accident 200 years ago. The second time was from a disease that attacked my nervous system. Third time was simply because my body was wearing out. Professor Velik stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. 200 years ago? How old are you? I am currently 307 years old, Wanho replied, though I have been in this particular body for only 20 years. The professor began pacing back and forth behind his desk. This is madness. You are talking about technologies that violate the fundamental laws of nature. We are talking about technologies that overcome the limitations of biology, Sola corrected. Death is not a law of nature. It is simply a failure of technology. But what about the social implications? Professor Velik demanded. What happens to a society when beings do not die? What happens to evolution, to progress, to the natural order of things? We adapt, Temin said. Human society has already adapted to longer lifespans. We have developed new social structures, new economic systems, new ways of organizing civilization. Can the psychological effects? The professor asked. Surely beings are not meant to live forever. The mind must break down eventually. We have solutions for that too, Mira said. Memory editing technology allows us to remove traumatic experiences or compress old memories to make room for new ones. We can also partition consciousness to prevent mental overload. Professor Velik stopped pacing and stared at the humans. You are describing the complete transformation of what it means to be alive. You're talking about becoming something that is no longer natural. We are talking about becoming something better, Doyon said firmly. Why should we accept death when we can choose life? Why should we accept suffering when we can choose enhancement? Because it is natural, the professor said desperately. Because it is the way things are supposed to be. According to who? Wano asked. Who decided that death is natural and immortality is not? Who made the rule that beings must accept limitations instead of overcoming them? The humans looked at Professor Velik with expressions of genuine curiosity, as if they truly did not understand why he was so disturbed by their revelations. On Earth, we have a saying, Sala said quietly. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Human culture has always been about fighting against limitations, about refusing to accept defeat. Death is not defeat, Professor Velik protested. Death is transformation, completion, the natural end of existence. Death is the end of possibility, Myra countered. It is the ultimate limitation. Why would any rational being choose to end their existence when they could choose to continue it? What about meaning? The professor asked. What about the meaning that comes from knowing life is finite? We create our own meaning, Taman replied. We do not need the threat of death to give our lives purpose. We can find purpose in endless learning, endless growth, endless experience. Professor Velik sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. How many humans are truly immortal? Define immortal, Wanho said. We can die from accidents or violence, but we cannot die from age or disease. We can be killed, but we cannot simply fade away. There are currently over 10,000 humans who have lived for more than 500 years, Sola added. Some have been alive for over 1,000 years, and they are all mentally stable, the professor asked. They are all functional, Mara. Corrected. Mental stability is relative. When you have lived for centuries, you develop different perspectives on existence. Different how? Professor Velik pressed. The humans were quiet for a long moment. Then Doyan spoke. When you know you will live forever, you stop thinking in terms of lifespans and start thinking in terms of projects. You stop planning for decades and start planning for centuries. You stop worrying about individual failures and start focusing on long-term success. You become patient, Taman added. It's very patient. And you become curious, Wano said. You have endless time. You want to learn everything, experience everything, understand everything. That is why we are here, Sola concluded. Okay, we are not really students in the traditional sense. We are immortal beings who have chosen to spend some of our infinite time learning about the galaxy. Professor Velik stared at the humans with growing horror. You are not here to get an education. You are here to study us. The humans did not deny it. We are here to learn, Mira said carefully, about alien cultures, about different approaches to existence, about the galaxy itself. And how long have you been doing this? A professor asked. I've been attending universities across the galaxy for over 200 years, Doyen said. I have studied at 43 different institutions. We all have, Wonho added. Education is one of the ways we pass time. Professor Velik realized with growing dread that he was not talking to students at all. He was talking to ancient beings who have been alive longer than his entire civilization. The horror of it struck him like a physical blow. These humans were not just immortal. They were eternal learners, eternal wanderers, eternal beings who moved through the galaxy like ghosts, studying and learning and never dying. And they had been hiding among the other species for centuries. The final class meeting was scheduled for the following week, but Professor Velik knew he could not face those human students again without understanding the full truth. He had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about his conversation with them, and each revelation had been more disturbing than the last. He was not the only one struggling with what he had learned. Word had somehow spread through the alien student population that something was terribly wrong with the humans. The ethereals had stopped attending classes entirely, claiming their crystal forms were too agitated to focus. The collective members moved in tight groups, their shared consciousness buzzing with anxiety. The luminari flickered constantly, unable to maintain stable energy forms on the day of the final presentations. Professor Velik entered his classroom to find only half his students present. The aliens who had come sat as far from the human section as possible, their body language radiating fear and discomfort. The humans arrived exactly on time, as they always did. They took their seats with the same casual confidence they had always displayed, seemingly unaware of the effect they were having on their classmates. Today, we will conclude our study of cultural approaches to mortality, Professor Velik announced, his voice lacking its usual authority. Are there any final questions or observations? One of the remaining ethereal students, a being named Crystal, raised a trembling appendage. Professor, we need to know something. How long have the humans really been students here? Professor Velik looked at the human section. Perhaps you should ask them directly. Christ turned to face the humans, her crystal form dim with fear. How long have you been at this academy? Cayman looked at his fellow humans, then back at Crystal. I enrolled here 47 years ago for my first semester, but I have been taking classes on and off for about 30 years total. 30 years, Crystal whispered. But the longest any student has ever attended the academy is 8 years for advanced doctoral programs. We are not traditional students, Mira explained gently. We take breaks between our studies to pursue other interests. What other interests? A collective member asked, their skin shifting to deep purple with worry. Research projects, Wanho replied. Travel. Sometimes we spend decades working on specific problems or exploring particular regions of the galaxy. How many schools have you attended? Another alien student asked. The humans looked at each other, and Professor Velik could see them making some kind of silent calculation. I have studied at 73 different institutions across the galaxy, Doyen said finally. Universities, research facilities, cultural centers, military academies. I have attended 91, Sola added, though some of them no longer exist. No longer exist. Professor Velik asked with growing dread. Species die out, Teeman explained matter-of-factly. Civilizations fall, stars burn out. We have outlived several entire species that we studied. Within the past, the classroom fell into horrified silence. The alien students stared at the humans with expressions of pure terror as the full implications sank in. You have watched entire species go extinct, Crystal said, her voice barely audible. You have outlived civilizations. We have, Mira confirmed. It is one of the consequences of immortality. You watch things end while you continue. How do you bear it? Illuminari asked, their energy form flickering wildly. How do you live? With the knowledge that everything around you will die while you remain. You adapt, Wanho said simply. You learn to value the time you have with others, even knowing it is temporary for them. But do you not feel lonely? Professor Velik asked. Despite himself. Ki, do you not feel isolated from the rest of existence? We have each other, Doyen replied. There are thousands of immortal humans spread across the galaxy. We form our own communities, our own relationships. And you just move from place to place, studying and learning forever. Crystal asked. Not forever, Taemin corrected. We can choose to end our existence if we want to. Some humans have made that choice after living for many centuries, but most of us find existence too interesting to give up. What do you do with all the knowledge you gather? A collective member asked. What is the purpose of endless learning? The same purpose as any learning, Sala replied. Understanding, growth, the satisfaction of knowing more today than you knew yesterday. But it never ends, Professor Velik said. Your learning never ends. Your existence never ends. You are trapped in an eternal cycle. We prefer to think of it as an eternal opportunity, Mira said. Every day brings new possibilities, new experiences, new knowledge. Is that what the title means? Crystal asked suddenly. Loop. You are trapped in a loop of endless existence. The humans were quiet for a moment. Then Doyen nodded slowly. In a way, yes. We are caught in a loop of learning, growing, and experiencing. We move from place to place, school to school, life to life, but we never truly move forward in the way other species do. We never reach an endpoint, Wanho added. We never achieve completion or final understanding. Just continue. That sounds like a form of hell, a luminari said, their energy form barely visible with distress. To you, perhaps? Taman replied. To us, it is simply existence. We've forgotten what it feels like to face mortality. This is normal for us. Now, Professor Velik stood up abruptly. I cannot continue this class, he announced. I need time to process what I have learned. Professor, Mira called as he headed toward the door. Will you be filing a report about us with the Academy administration? Professor Velik stopped and turned back. Should I? That is your decision, Doyen said. But you should know that we are not unique, okay? There are immortal humans at universities across the galaxy. Okay? We have been part of galactic education for centuries. How many? Professor Velik whispered. Hundreds, Sola answered. Maybe thousands. We do not keep exact counts. Professor Velik left the classroom without another word. Behind him, the remaining alien students sat in stunned silence, staring at the humans who had just revealed themselves to be ancient beings trapped in an endless cycle of existence. Over the following days, word spread throughout the academy about what had been discovered. Alien students began requesting transfers away from any classes that included humans. Some left the academy entirely, too frightened to continue their studies, knowing that immortal beings were walking among them, the humans. Meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered by the chaos they had caused. They continued attending their classes, continued their research, continued their endless pursuit of knowledge and experience. Professor Velik eventually filed his report. But he was told that the Academy administration had been aware of the immortal human students for decades. They were considered valuable assets, beings who could provide perspectives that spanned centuries of experience. A month later, new human students enrolled at the Academy. Their application materials listed them as young adults, beginning their university education. But Professor Velik looked at them and wondered how many lifetimes of knowledge lay behind their youthful faces. In the library, Stoyan and Mira sat at their usual table, researching their next semester's courses. They had already selected classes in advanced quantum mechanics, ancient galactic history, and xenobiological engineering. What do you think we should study after we finish here? Myra asked, looking up from her course catalog. I was thinking about going back to the Andorian Institute, Doyen replied. They have a new program in consciousness studies that looks interesting. How long has it been since we were there last? About 60 years, long enough for them to have developed new theories. Mira nodded and made a note on her datapad. And, after that, there are some new universities opening in the Outer Rim territories. We could spend a few decades exploring those. They returned to their research, planning their education centuries into the future with the same casual attitude that other beings might plan their weekend activities around them. Kalian students gave them a wide berth, too frightened to approach. The immortal beings who had turned the simple concept of education into an eternal loop of learning and existence. The humans did not seem to notice or care about the fear they inspired. They were already focused on their next classes, their next schools, their next centuries of endless learning in their infinite loop of immortal existence.